A new commandment that I give you, that you love one another. It is an old and admittedly somewhat trite saying that you cannot legislate morality, and yet it appears from this gospel lesson to be true. A new commandment I give you, that you love one another. It really wasn't all that new if you think about it. Jesus had an encounter with a young lawyer at one point earlier in that gospel, and he summed up the ancient scriptures for that young man, that you are to love God with all your heart and your soul and your mind, and then love your neighbor as yourself. So, in one sense, it is not a new commandment, but it is reiterated that you love one another. The context for this so-called new commandment is the Last Supper. It's the feast of the Passover, when all good Jews celebrate that escape from slavery, being led by Moses through the Red Sea and into a new land. We are told that God is the source of all life, and that His promise is that these people, these former slaves, and in one sense, the escaping ones, are God's special people. He will be their God and they will be His people. Theologians call that designation, you will be my people. They call that God's particularity, the scandal of God's particularity. I like what Ogden Nash wrote. How odd of God to choose the Jews. The response of God's people, the response and responsibility of being God's people, is called Torah. Torah. One definition of Torah is that it is law. But another broader definition is it is any and all things that you must believe and do in being God's special people. And summed up in loving God and loving one another. A new commandment I give you, that you love one another. Walter Brueggemann, probably from modern times, one of the greatest Old Testament scholars living, was on the faculty of a nearby university. He was giving a series of lectures at Trinity Church, Wall Street. They were being televised and broadcast to all of the participating Episcopal cathedrals around the country, so that you could watch his speeches and then ask questions remotely and have him address them. One caller asked Dr. Brueggemann what we could possibly learn from people who had refused to accept Jesus as their Messiah. And this is his response. Christians are only concerned about faith. Jews are concerned about obedience. What we learn from them is what it means to obey God. Obedience. A new commandment I give you, that you love one another. Seems to me that we have lost sight of the fact that there is obedience in loving. We have the notion that loving has all to do with a feeling. One of my students at Brunel was desperately in love. She says, "My boyfriend brings me flowers every Friday evening. Isn't that sweet?" And I've heard males say something similar about, "She builds me up. She makes me feel good about myself." What about when love doesn't feel good? Every parent knows that getting up in the middle of the night with a sick child does not feel good. But you do it. For years I had a rocking chair in my office that I moved from the house to that office because it was a symbol for me. That rocking chair has rocked to China and back with everything from throwing up to measles to chicken pox, you name it. It is a symbol for me of love that doesn't feel good. What about the mother that I came to know when I was teaching at the women's prison in South Atlanta? For years she had struggled with her daughter's addiction. Knew her daughter was taking money out of her purse, trying to ignore the lies that she told of where she was and what she was doing. And finally, one day, she called the police. She turned her daughter in. I came to know her because she came to that prison on the days that I taught, once a month, for 2.5 years. That's tough love. That's love that doesn't feel good. Never gave up on her. Always wanted her back, but clean and sober. Tough love. You see, mature love, tough love, is the willful decision. The willful decision to care and nurture your own self or another person. If in doing that you occasionally feel good, so much the better. There's not a parent alive who doesn't know something about tough love. Jesus tells his disciples that they are to love one another as he has loved them. As he has loved them. And then he went on to tell them the things that they needed to hear and hang on to. First of all, he says, "You did not choose me, I chose you." I chose you. Remember when we were kids, in my neighborhood, long before we had organized sports, we had pickup ball games. The older kids were the captains, and they picked their people for their team. The smallest and the youngest were always the last to be picked. I remember that longing to grow up and grow older so that I wouldn't be among the last picked. We all know something of what that is like. Jesus didn't wait until his disciples were good enough or faithful enough or had great insights about the deity. No. He chose them while they were still sinful. See, that's what we do at baptism. we receive someone, be it infant or adult, we don't ask those questions that we ask in other dealings. What is your education? What is your experience? How much money do you have in the bank? On and on and on. If it's an adult, we ask, do you want to be baptized? An infant doesn't need to speak. You did not choose me, I chose you. The second thing that Jesus says to his disciples is, I call you friends. Friends. Not equals, but friends. Friends are the folks you are in the know with. Friends are the ones that you share things with. Sometimes they're good things and sometimes not. Years ago, I had an extremely close friend. We had been through a lot of things together. We spoke the truth to each other, but we spoke the truth in love. Unfortunately, that friend died at a very young age. And my fantasy is, what heaven is like is when we are reunited with those whom we call friends. Those who have meant so much to us. The last thing Jesus says to those disciples at that meal is, whatever you ask in the Father's name, he will give you. Now, I'm not real sure about all of that. I have asked some things that God has yet to deliver on. Often for my own good sake. What I am sure of is that God knows the pleadings of my heart, and his desire for me is wholeness. Wholeness. Albert Einstein was once asked, what is the most important question that you can ask? And he said, is the universe we live in a friendly place? I think the answer has to be yes, because the God who created that universe is basically a friend. So a new commandment I give you, that you love one another as I have loved you. These things I have spoken to you, that my joy may be in you and that your joy may be full. That's a friend who wants only for you and for me that our joy be full. Amen.